Welcome, everyone. We're just giving a second for everyone to get into the webinar room. And it looks like the attendees are continuing to come on in. So we're just going to give it about 15 more seconds while the attendee list populates. Well, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are in the US. My name's Alex Cornell-Duhu. I'm the president of Elected Officials to Protect America, which is a nonprofit that focuses on climate change. And particularly today, we'll be focusing on national security and climate change. I'm very excited to be here with a number of distinguished guests for our climate summit. This will be the press conference that is the precursor to a White House summit where about 100 lawmakers who are veterans and frontline leaders will be working with the White House to look at policy solutions surrounding the climate crisis. For me, this became personal and close to home when I was deployed to Iraq with the Marine Corps. And while I was out there, my vehicle was hit by a roadside bomb. Fortunately, the guy who did it wasn't very good at his job, and we were able to catch him. In that process and the investigation, we found out he was a farmer who had been paid by Al-Qaeda to plant the roadside bomb because his crops had failed due to a massive drought because of climate change. And this opened my eyes up about how climate change is also a security threat. Number of years later, I was in Afghanistan, and at the Battle of Farah, the Taliban actually tweeted out, "We're taking the city for their water." And we had to do a community meeting with the local population to assure them that we would protect the water. So these are stories that a lot of elected officials and others have similar experiences, whether at home or abroad. And I'd like to introduce a number of distinguished individuals who have been deeply engaged in this topic to talk about what their stories are, but also the solutions to tackle the climate crisis. So first, we'll start with Congressman Ruben Geiger. He is the House Chair of the Special Operations Subcommittee and Intelligence. He is also a Marine Corps veteran, of which I'm very proud. Congressman?
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone, for having me today. As Alex said, I'm Congressman Ruben Gallego of Arizona 7th District, a district that is actually directly in the main gun site of climate change. We are an arid place here in Arizona, and we are very water dependent, obviously, and are worried about the future. But of course, this is talking about the world at large in terms of where we're going and the threat that comes from climate change. I think we're very lucky to have an administration that finally is committed to actually solving the climate crisis by actually putting pen to paper as well as a budget to it with the Build Back Better plan. And I'd like to thank President Biden and Vice President Harris for that. But there's just a lot more to go and a lot more to do. And I think it's important for us as policymakers, especially veterans policymakers that work in the national security space, to really explain how this isn't just a lefty sort of thing, a tree hugger sort of thing. This is actually a national security issue that we have to contend with. We just heard Alex's great background and story about how it's directly impacted him. But it's a growing crisis and problems. We can't deny that humans are always going to look for safety, and as climate change continues to really alter our environment, it's going to also alter what people do. And so when people need water, they will go looking for water. They will not observe international borders for it. If they can't feed themselves, they will try to find how to feed themselves, whether it's through illegal or illicit manners, like we just heard. And unfortunately, there are global actors, both are state actors and even non-state actors that will use that human suffering and even movements of human to their advantages. So we know the geopolitical consequences of climate change just aren't a problem for our children or grandchildren, but one that we'll see the effects of it in the very, very near future. A good example right now If you look no further than the Pacific, where China's moving to expand their reach, or in the Arctic, and you can see how they're damming up, for example, rivers that are affecting flows into Cambodia, into Laos, into India is another good example. Or in the Arctic, where because of climate change, Russia is actually increasing their capabilities in the Arctic, knowing that there's going to at one point be you'll be able to fully transit through the Arctic instead of having to go through the Panama Canal. And they're building up bases right now because of that. So these are real things that we are dealing with right now as policymakers, and these are real things that we want to work on as policymakers in the immediate future, because we want to mitigate these national security impacts. This is the things that we do as policymakers. When it comes to national security, we think about the future and what we can do to mitigate the risks to our sovereignty as a country, and really stabilizing the world when it comes to climate change and reducing our carbon footprint and carbon addiction is also part of that. And I think about that every day. Even last year's NDA, we require the Pentagon to create a climate roadmap to improve the DoD resiliency and assess various climate vulnerabilities. And when we do that on the armed services, it's a statement of fact that is something that we are worried about. Again, if we're talking about it on the Armed Services Committee, we're talking about it within our national security circles. It's something that we should, the public should realize, again, that this is something that is important for them, obviously for their own health, for their future, but also for the near future when it comes to security and stability. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel. And then, of course, we'll gladly take some questions.
Cool. Well, thank you, Congressman. Next, we have Representative Paul Evans from Oregon. He's also the EOPA co-chair of our National Leadership Council and a Army, excuse me, I put you in the wrong branch for a second.
Oh my goodness.
Air Force veteran.
Thank you very much. I am Paul Evans. I represent House District 20, about 75,000 folks in Oregon and the area around Salem, and including parts of West and South Salem, Monmouth, and Independence. I actually came to the legislature after serving as a senior policy advisor to then Governor Kulongoski, after spending a bunch of time in active duty and then going back into the Guard. And the things that I'd like to share today really have 3 points. The first is the time for the debating about whether or not climate change is a clear and present danger to the security of the country is over. Anybody from this moment forward who doesn't get it never will get it, and probably shouldn't be in a position to have any influence whatsoever. The second point is that the effects are not only real, but they're happening faster than we anticipated. And I want to get back to that in just a minute. And the third is that we actually have some, I believe, tools at our disposal if we rethink some of the ways in which we value water and minerals. So as a state legislator, I don't have a lot to do in terms of national policy, but we have been in Oregon working very hard over the last 20, 30 years really on trying to develop policies that are both helpful for the environment in at least slowing the rate of change, and at the same time coming up with methodologies that make financial sense, because we are not a rich state. We come out of a natural resources exploitive background. That's what we did. And trying to be able to have an economy even as we make the world better. We have really focused on renewable energies. We have focused on trying to get out of coal and get out of the basic things we know cause problems. But you also have to have an ability to generate enough power to be able to maintain things. Most of the environmental issues until 2020 were in many ways seen as a left or right, Republican or Democratic thing. And then in Labor Day of 2020, we had the largest fires Oregon has ever had, with toxicity in the air that rivaled Beijing and other places. We burned over 1 million acres in 2020, which for Oregon is unusual, to say the least. This year, we're at around 600,000 acres. There's a recognition of the linkage between the shift in global climate activities and the effects upon the flora and fauna that have made Oregon traditionally a wet place. That is an important thing. It is in fact affecting us right now, putting our crops in danger, putting our people in increased harm's way. The second thing, in terms of what Oregon and what I believe we can do is recognize that we have been in many ways valuing water and minerals in a one-use application. I come out of, I spent some time on the city council, and I know that sewers and effluent reuse programs are not exactly sexy topics for the national the conversation. But I think it's time we rethink the ability to multiple use water for all the different things we do. For example, effluent reuse has been proven to be able to keep bad things out of the rivers and the waters, and at the same time provide a use that has storage capacity. We also, I think, need to look at desalinization efforts. In Oregon, I was raised to believe that it would always rain. Well, we're starting to recognize that it may always rain, but it's not going to rain as much, and it's not going to rain where we thought it would. I live in an area that was shaped in many ways by power. We basically made the rivers generate power. That's how the Northwest was really built. I think it's time we think about using the power that is becoming more and more renewable to put water in places around the country where it's necessary to at least stem the tide of the shift in terms of the loss of flora and fauna and soil and other things that are currently happening at a faster and faster rate. I will tell you, at the state level, talking about desalinization in Oregon gets a very strange look from many people. I keep trying to suggest that if global climate change continues to make the oceans bigger, that's just a whole lot of water supply that we haven't figured out yet how to distribute. The third thing I want to emphasize is that the time is now. And at the legislative level, I know from just watching the fights in the Klamath Basin and watching the inability of communities to recover as fast and as well from the fires that we've had, and just even going and visiting the forest and seeing the very quick change in terms of what insects are here and what insects aren't, what trees are growing, what trees aren't, the health of the soil, the health of the water that in our place is connected to salmon. It is a fundamental error in judgment to not recognize the moment we have right now, to step up and to recognize the resources we have with 330 million Americans. If we decide to make this a consumer-driven effort to change the equation, I think we really can, but it's going to take leadership at all levels of government. And I'm grateful for this panel. I'm grateful for the work being done by Congress. I also want to end real quickly with saying thank you to Representative or Congressman Gallegos. In his NDAA that I believe is at least being discussed right now, it looked like there were about $17 billion put aside for installation mitigation, preparation, and forward thinking in terms of how we actually ensure the safety of the force and our facilities. And I just want to say I appreciate that very much. Thank you for allowing me to be here.
Well, thank you, sir. Elegant as ever. Next, we'd love to introduce Sherry Goodman. She's the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, Secretary General for International Military Council on Climate and Security, and board member and advisors for the Truman National Security Project. And we are very grateful to have you here today. Ma'am?
Thank you very much, Alex. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. It's very important that we're addressing this issue and mobilizing the creativity and spirit of veteran elected officials to address what is the most existential threat of our era, climate change. And, you know, having served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security in the 1990s, before climate change was really at the forefront of American consciousness, and now seeing today that we have wildfires year-round in the West and rampant storms across the East Coast and flooding across the Midwest and many more extreme weather events, we know that the climate era has arrived on us with a vengeance. And I had the privilege of organizing and leading, starting 15 years ago now, the first military advisory board on climate change and national security. And we'll have one of our members, Admiral Lee, today. So now that the military leadership at all levels of command, and Alex, you shared with us your personal experience, so important in Iraq and Afghanistan, is how you saw firsthand how drought and water driven by climate insecurities has led to terror around the world. We know that climate change acts as a threat multiplier. That's abundantly clear. And we see it every day, from rising temperatures, twice the rate in the Arctic as the rest of the world, a whole new ocean opened up in our lifetimes, sea ice retreat, drought across much of our own country and across already parched parts of the Sahel in Africa and the Middle East and parts of Asia. We see permafrost collapsing and changing in the Arctic and other regions. And we see also flooding occurring and sea level rise, changing our coastal areas. We now know, for example, that our forces are as likely to be deployed to provide natural disaster relief as they are for an away mission. And that's been a real change in our lifetimes, a real change just in recent years, that our now forces are having to come to the rescue of Americans because of our climate-fueled disasters. And so it's a wake-up call for everyone. And I want to thank the leadership of Ruben and others on the Armed Services Committee who have shown foresight in recent years to add provisions into the Defense Authorization Bill to direct the Department of Defense, and then indeed in other agencies, address, for example, installation resilience and improve the resilience of our military bases. And also, of course, the president has shown leadership with his extensive executive orders and his commitment to move towards a net zero economy. And that's going to have important. I want to underscore sort of a couple of 3 points here. First is the overall commitment to address how we reduce climate risk starts, of course, with transforming our economy at every sector. And that's where a lot of the focus is right now on the current legislation, the energy transition and the mitigation of greenhouse gases. But indeed, there is so much more that needs to be done. And much of that goes to the second piece of the climate risk equation, which is not just the mitigation, but how we do adaptation and resilience. And here's where I think, our military and the national security community can really lead by example, because our military bases are like small cities and our communities are affected and we live in the community. And as we climate proof our installations and our communities and our troops, we improve the lives of all Americans. And that is vitally important. The second piece of this is not just infrastructure, but it's the health of our troops. Increasingly, our troops have to operate in extreme heat, and they also have to operate in support to wildfire risk, putting them at risk for the air pollution. So I see that there's a focus now, which I applaud, by the Department of Defense to address extreme heat risk for our forces. And that's going to be, I think, increasingly important to protect the health and safety of our troops. And finally, I want to underscore and also thank the Congress, but also say I think we have more that we need to do to advance climate predictive capability, both in our national security community, so that we can use the foresight that we have brought to understanding future threats, whether they were terror threats or others, and use that in a more dedicated way in our national security planning, both for the military, for the intelligence community, and also for civil sectors of society. We are on the cusp now of a revolution in climate data analytics, driven by AI and the ability to close the gap between short-term weather prediction and longer-term climate. And that climate analytic revolution is going to help us enormously in our ability to prevent further harm to lives of people around the world. And I urge the inclusion of that in further action. So with that, I thank you, all of you, for being part of this and for bringing this excellent group together today.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. I mean, one of the points about the health of our service members and how the impact it has on them and climate change is one that I have not seen as much. So that's a really important one to bring up, I think, too, because the austere conditions it creates, not only for them, but everyone around them, is increasingly becoming more dangerous. So next, I'd love to introduce John Powers. He's the former federal chief sustainability officer, co-founder of the Veterans Energy Project, co-founder and president of Clean Capital, and an Army veteran. And it's great to be working with him again after many years at the Truman Project.
Yeah, Alex, thanks so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity and the comments from our distinguished speakers. Really honored to be part of this. Like Alex, I was, and many of our speakers, I spent 15 months in Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom as a young lieutenant and later captain in the Army. And for many, like many veterans, that was a life-changing experience. We lived in Uday Hussein's palace on the Tigris River right in the beginning of the war. We had every evening, we had our fuel trucks that, we parked there that basically ran almost all of our operations, from our communications to our Humvees and our artillery pieces. And we had a group of Iraqis who lived on the base with us. And every day they would leave that base at the end to go home. And we knew they were taking critical intelligence with them. And if we had left at 6 o'clock, we knew by about 6:45, we'd be receiving mortar rounds wherever those fuel trucks were. It was always targeted towards the fuel truck. So we knew when they left, we'd have to move them to the other side of the campus. That was the first time I really began to think about energy and energy security. And as I began to dive in more, like many veterans, realized that, at the time and continue, our energy infrastructure, our energy plans were not enough to really move us in an energy secure way. And then I really began to understand climate change and began to build a career in it. Went on to serve as Alex mentioned, I was the first special advisor on energy to the Army, helping to stand up the Army's clean energy programs. And later on, had the honor to serve as President Obama's chief sustainability officer. And like many military national security leaders, we're well aware of the risks climate change poses, not just to our forces and the mission that we support, but to the work, and military leaders are working to address this every day. I want to switch the conversation a little bit here from the risks, really to the opportunities we have to invest in climate change solutions. Like many veterans, I've gone on to build a career addressing climate change. And as Alex mentioned, I co-founded a company called Clean Capital. We've invested in nearly $1 billion in clean energy projects here domestically and are continuing to grow. Every investment we make in clean energy not only reduces emissions, but helps our military forces in a more self-sustaining and secure way. American-made clean energy will ensure a safer America for the next generation. To give you a sense of the opportunity here, in 2020, we invested about $500 billion in transitioning to the clean energy future here in the US. But to really address climate change, we need to double that to over $1 trillion. This is really enabled by $1 trillion annually. This is really enabled by President Biden's Build Back Better plan. The investment will not only fuel our economy, but also fuel jobs. The Build Back Better plan supports Americans' clean energy businesses that invest in Americans' heroes. American veterans are mission driven and have the skills and training that are ideally suited for the clean energy industry. And we're seeing that today in the work that they're doing. Already, veterans are building successful businesses and careers in clean energy all over the country. The president's plan will double on these victories and ensure the country continues to be a world leader in these booming economic sectors. For example, the solar industry is one of the fastest growing industries in the nation. It really offers tremendous opportunity for workers of all backgrounds. The US Solar employs more than 230,000 workers as of 2020. Compare that to about 50,000 people that work in the coal industry. Nearly 8% of those solar workers in the nation are veterans. And that's more than the national average, which is around 6%. And many of these jobs are in areas like installation, production, manufacturing, sales, or management, and jobs that can't be shipped overseas. As Alex mentioned, I'm part of the Veterans Energy Project, and that's a network of veterans around the country who've been driven by mission to come home and get involved in solving climate change and work in the clean energy space. Veterans are 45% more likely to be self-employed or small business owners. And the president's plan empowers all small businesses, especially in the clean energy industry, funding innovation hubs around the country, investing in billions of dollars in programs to connect small businesses to federal research and help us solve the climate crisis that we're in today. The reality is we must act now. We must pass the legislation that's in front of Congress as soon as possible, because inaction is not just too risky. The opportunity of action is too great to miss. So thanks, Alex, for the opportunity.
Really well stated. The opportunity here is just amazing, given with the ingenuity of companies like yours to launch America and to continue to lead. So that's the exciting part of this. We have tremendous opportunities here to move forward. As a quick aside, if you have a question, you're thinking about it or brought something up, please feel free to type that in the Q&A box so we can just populate those and they'll be ready for when we get to Q&A. We're also happy to bring you into the conversation if you want to ask your question in person. Next, I'd love to introduce Vice Admiral Lee Gunn, retired. He was the former Inspector General of the Department of the Navy and is a member of the American Security Project. Sir?
It's really terrific to be here, and thanks very much for the opportunity to serve on this panel. I'm an old friend of Sherry Goodman and a longtime admirer of hers, and a great deal of what I've done that may turn out to be productive in the climate and energy world is due to a team that Sherry put together. But I've experienced during my career at sea, after 35 years in the Navy, I spent the majority of that time at sea. I've experienced the true full-on fury of nature in a Cat 5 typhoon. In the Western Pacific, hurricanes are called typhoons. And I recognize the power of the issues we're facing in those kinds of illustrations. And during my time as the Inspector General for the Navy and the Marine Corps, I witnessed what I thought were increasing effects of climate and drought and floods and the like on the readiness of our armed forces. Much of what our military members will tell you that they do when they're not actually on mission in the United States or overseas is train and become more ready to perform those missions. That requires that ranges be available in the United States and that the tasks that they are asked to perform contribute to readiness and not just to dealing with the effects of climate change at home. So I saw that the changing of the climate around us was increasingly affecting not only the health, as somebody mentioned earlier, potentially of our servicemen and women, but also their ability to remain ready to perform missions downrange. I mentioned just a second ago, and Sherry Goodman mentioned the Military Advisory Board that she founded at the CNA Corporation. It's still my privilege to be part of that after almost 15 years. And we have now 35 of us who've served on the Military Advisory Board, retired 3- and 4-star admirals and generals from all of the US Armed Services, have been privileged to look at climate, energy, and water from a national security perspective. And we can confirm, and the 8 reports that we've issued confirm very much the things that my other panelists are saying here, my fellow panelists, that the climate change effects are profound and growing more serious and impacting not only the economy, not only the diplomatic strength, not only the persuasive ability of the United States around the world, while we fail to reassume or assume a leadership position in dealing with climate change, but also in the direct effects on US military power. Many of the things that are increasingly calls that the military of the United States has to answer involve humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And so the good work that young men and women in uniform on behalf of the people of the United States do around the world to recover from events like Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines several years ago, where by 48 or 72 hours after the passage of the typhoon over the main islands of the Philippines, there were nearly 20,000 US Americans in uniform from all the services, plus the US Public Health Service, who were on scene helping the people of the Philippines and building this goodwill on behalf of the American people that results from those kinds of activities. We have in our country right now a deficit of trust, I think. People have come to doubt the facts around him and the things that we say one another to each other. It seems to me that we have at our disposal potentially something that can be helpful in restoring that trust. The title of this panel today is National Climate Plan, an emergency declaration leading into the White House summit in a little bit. It seems to me that if the net is cast widely enough and stakeholders are sufficiently involved in creating a national climate plan, and there never has been one, that we will be able to mobilize Americans through an emergency declaration that will allow us to put our shoulders to the wheel in a way that hasn't been done in the United States since the Second World War. Representative Evans talked about the need to cooperate. Earlier this morning, I attended another event. His Royal Highness Prince Al Hassan bin Talal of Jordan coined a term I had not heard before. We lived during the Cold War with potential for mutually assured destruction. He talks about mutually assured survival. And that is an idea, I think, that Americans need to adopt again. We've lost much of that. And so I'd like to conclude here by saying that when I think about a national climate plan and an emergency declaration, it seems to me that a climate plan is an expression, an urgent public expression, reaffirming the intent of Americans to shoulder our responsibilities. We're not only dealing with climate change, not only mitigating and adapting to it ourselves, but leading that mitigation and adaptation around the world. And I think that's an important outcome of the conversations that we're having today and the conversations that the White House will have with Congress and others over the coming months. So thanks again. Glad to be here. Looking forward to everybody's questions.
Thank you, sir. That's really well put. We need the mutually assured success, right? That's the pathway we should be heading on. One question that did come to mind, I know the West right now is in a mega drought, and a lot of the challenges with national security and climate change, we see them internationally. That's through my stories and others that are very blatant in conflict areas, but sometimes more subtle when it comes to back to the US, like Saudi Arabia buying up water rights in California and Arizona and other places, the UAE and China, and back in our home yard. I mean, Congressman, do you have any comments or thoughts on the severe drought that's creating conditions, particularly in Arizona and the West, and how it's tied internationally with some foreign governments buying up these water rights?
Well, you got to remember, when it comes to the West, there's always been water fights, right? And some of them have been legally, and some of them have been kinetic, as we like to say. As a matter of fact, we have a saying in Arizona, water's for fighting and whiskey's for drinking. And some of like the biggest battles actually have been between, for example, cattle barons and farmers fighting over who has the right to use the water to farm versus who has the right to use it for graze, right? And now in Arizona, we're going to eventually have a legal battle, probably between our agricultural industry and our cities, where actually the cities are better at water management and our agricultural is not. And now we do see examples of foreign entities, and it's not just, by the way, Saudi Arabia. Now you actually see China also really getting into like kind of the mega farms, where they're buying up. And when I think people kind of get this mixed up. They're not buying water rights. What they're doing is you're buying land that has intense water usage, right? Like, for example, Saudi Arabia has bought 10,000 of acres worth of of land where they can build, grow hay for their very expensive horses. Now, the problem with that is like they are taking that hay and they're exporting it all the way to Saudi Arabia, in the process taking out all that water from the land. So in that regard, that is a problem. Now, how does this look in the rest of the world when you start stretching it out? Well, when water is a commodity, it's going to cause a lot of problems, because if the richer countries have access to water as a commodity, you're going to have poorer countries, or just society in general, that are going to look at that as a good that's being taken away from the public domain. And I think there's going to cause a lot of strife, right? You're going to see this happening, especially in countries that are bordering other countries that are upstream from them. So a good example, again, I brought this up, is China dealing with its neighbors right now. They're going to start building dams and have built some dams that have affected fishing livestocks, that have affected water flows into rice paddies south of China, and eventually, again, people will always take care of their own interests. We all know that, and countries will take care of their own interests, and this will lead to conflict. It will. And and if you want to go to a really small example, in Arizona, we actually used to have water battles, straight up shootouts between cowboys and farmers. And a really good example that many of you guys will know, but never really attached to it, it goes back to the OK Corral, and that was really a shootout between cowboys and also the more established farmers, which is supported by the sheriff of that town at that point and the marshal. So think about that. Now put it into a larger scale across the country and then across the world in 20 years, and you're going to see a lot of things happening. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be more shootouts unless things are going to be adjudicated in a courtroom.
So,
Oh, go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
No, please, Paul.
if I could, I live in the West that is the west of the mountains west, which is generally seen as different than the Intermountain West. And when it comes to water, we're a little bit late to the debate in terms of thinking about it as something that has a limit. But in reviewing this and in really looking at successful strategies across the globe that have managed scarce resources, I think there are three specific functions or factors that need to be put into the equation for long-term water strategy. The first is storage, because in a lot of ways, in a lot of places, the rapid climate change has altered the way in which the water naturally has been stored, and that water is not staying where it used to be. And we need to get more creative in finding ways to keep the habitats that we're used to that particular type of activity naturally, because they're going to need quite frankly, less effort and less money to be able to stabilize. The second is usage in terms of a balance. Just because you want to grow cows or want to grow things in the middle of a desert doesn't necessarily mean that's the best, highest use, which gets into the third point, which is some kind of global limits and prioritization. Much like we're trying to get to with the Paris Accord on sequestration, there needs to be a global understanding, and I go back to what the Vice Admiral Gunn said, mutual assured understanding and mutual assured priorities to make sure that we're not misusing water in a place where we can, quite frankly, never get ahead of the curve, and not putting water in places that will actually grow food for a global population that's getting closer and closer to 8 billion. There needs to be that discussion about how we use water, where it's used, how we store it, and ultimately, what's the best, highest activity in a particular space of land, given all the other factors that are at play.
Alex, can I sort of step back from the domestic for a second and look at the international, look at just to really address how climate change and national security come together for many of the regions that are being affected by climate, driving water scarcity and drought. One really good example is Yemen. And for those that follow national security, Yemen's been at war for almost 6 years now, almost parallel tracked to water scarcity in that country. It's a country where the majority of folks' employment would be agriculture, but now there are not just millions of people unemployed, you have almost 5 million people who are a meal away from famine. I mean, the food insecurity, water insecurity, all those factors come together. The reason the climate change is sort of thought as a multiplier here is it drives that insecurity within some places that are already destabilized. So Yemen is a good example, sub-Saharan Africa. You don't have a government that can approach and address these challenges like the work that Ruben is doing or Paul is doing, at both the national and local level here, right? So as a result, that insecurity drives, for instance, a young male population who's unemployed into the hands of extremist groups who then go and do, as Alex mentioned, lay roadside bombs or get involved in a civil war. That has dramatic effects, not just on our international security, but our national security as well. And as climate change continues to worsen, the effects continue to worsen. we'll see more and more of that instability in areas that don't have the capacity to manage it. And as a result, the Defense Department and will be doing more and more work in those spaces, just trying to keep not just the world stable, but our national security stable as well.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's very true. I mean, the Center for Naval Analysis did a study that showed 70% of rule conflicts were related to water insecurity. And it's close to home too. I mean, in South America, and you think Brazil has a ton of water, they're actually in a pretty horrible drought right now. Venezuela, horrible droughts. That's causing more instability. And it's also both the hurricanes, as the Admirals mentioned, and drought that is causing huge migrations towards the borders. Again, causing, unfortunately, more instability. So if anyone would like to jump in and talk live, just raise your hand and I'll bring you into the conversation. We also have a few questions posted on the board here. And the first one I'll look at here is, you mentioned solar is the largest growing renewable source of energy. Do we anticipate that this will be the next primary source of real energy? What are some of the other innovations and solutions that people have seen be effective in combating climate change? And I would just add, we're doing a White House summit. We're looking at members of Congress taking action, that being part of it.
Guys, let me talk about solar for a second, Alex, and I'll let others sort of dive in. But from the solar perspective, it is a growing portion of our energy base. And just last week, the Department of Energy under President Biden put out a blueprint to get us from 4% solar on the grid to almost 45%. That will drive not just manufacturing here at home, it'll drive jobs around installation. And it's important to think about solar as something that is no longer a pie in the sky concept, but something that major corporations like Google and Apple and Walmart and others are implementing into their business and budget strategies, because they want both the secure power that it can provide, but also, but solar is now in many places the cheapest type of power source in the grid. And we're able to tap into that power at really affordable rates, providing taxpayers and utility payers and companies real savings. The key, though, is transitioning our grid to be able to manage things like an influx of more solar and more wind, and things like the Build Back Better plan have those grid transition technologies and strategies in place to help drive some of that critical infrastructure build out that we need to have more distributed power sources. Our grid was a engineering feat of the 20th century. And the reality, though, is we are in a 21st century that needs a more sophisticated, more decentralized grid. And we are working towards that as we speak. But this plan will add the critical steroids we need to move it to the next level.
I would also add, in addition to solar, we also need to build out our offshore wind capability, which is happening under this administration. We have abundant wind in the United States, which hasn't been tapped. Many other countries are really tapping their wind resources. And then part of the Build Back Better plan is to advance electrification of all energy. And we need to do that with better batteries. We need better batteries. We need the infrastructure for batteries. We need to enable a true transition, from coal and oil into renewable powered electric charging, so that we can make the electric highway of the future really based on that clean energy. And I think there's also important opportunities for nuclear here in the mix too. We need advanced nuclear, and it's got to be part of the climate solution. We know how to do it, and the U.S. needs to be competitive in this market sector globally, because others like China and Russia are already selling advanced nuclear technologies to other countries, and we need to do so for both our own competitiveness and for the safety of the field. So those are just a few of the important areas I think we need to fire on all fronts.
This is Ruben Geiger, and I agree with all the statements prior to this, but I think it's really important that if you're going to do renewable energy, you actually have to have storage capacity. because a lot of times when we have peak energy use, usually from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. in most parts of the country, it's not sometimes the best time for actual like solar, or maybe wind isn't going. So advances in battery storage is going to be extremely important, both at the local level, right, for your house, if you want to have a battery in your house, or kind of grid level battery storage, right, something that we can move across the country depending on where you've stored it with instant demand. And I do agree with nuclear. There's two things I think that we need to remember with nuclear. Number one, until we actually catch up in terms of reducing our carbon footprint, we should not be decommissioning any nuclear power plants. I've seen, unfortunately, some people cheering some closing of nuclear power plants. Anytime a nuclear power plant closes in the United States right now, it's most likely going to be replaced with either coal or gas generation. And so that we're really taking steps back when it comes to that. And number two, there is a new movement and technology when it comes to mini nuclear power plants. There's one that's actually being created in Idaho right now. I'm going to be very interested to see how that goes in terms of, number one, its carbon footprint while it's being built, but also its generation and how much water it takes and how much electricity it produces. I think that's going to be extremely important. Lastly, I will say the one thing that we have to figure out is how do we help electrify Africa, right? Because one of the things that I think a lot of us want to say, it's like, well, everyone needs to reduce their carbon footprint around the world. Well, that's easy for us to say because we've already achieved a lot of our economic goals using carbon, right? And same with China, same with India. But now for us as countries with modern economies trying to tell Africa, which is going to have the largest population growth in the next 100 years, that they need to stop their economic growth and not have any electrification, which is really important, is, I think, number one, it's hypocritical, and number two, another form of colonialism. So we're going to have to figure out how to help electrify Africa in a way that severely is not severely dependent on carbon. And I think it's going to require, our, G7 countries to really, step up and actually subsidize the electrification of Africa, or else we're never really going to get in control of, I think, carbon output in this world.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The solutions and the technology that can be brought around the world that will be more effective than burning fossil fuels. It's really the neat part of this. I'll just add a quick aside here, is that the technology exists now, right? We have offshore wind turbines in Maine that are floating in deep waters, and that can be replicated to the offshore deep water in California. We have the first hydrogen-powered city coming online in California that was the first net zero city powered by solar. These solutions are here right now, and they can be implemented as seen by Mr. Power's success in solar.
Let me jump in here for just a second and pile on the idea that there's going to be a dramatic increase in demand for electricity around the world. We are going to have 1.5 billion new human beings added to the population between now and 2050. 1 billion of those in Africa, essentially doubling its population, and 500 million mostly in South Asia and in a few other places as well. Together with the desire of people to ascend to the middle class, this is going to place a dramatic demand signal to the energy industry. So we have to lead from the United States for both economic and for humanitarian reasons, as well as also for climate change reasons. These kinds of electrification that Alex is talking about and others have been talking about too, so that we can meet this increased demand, not with more coal, which is the way it's increasingly being done now, but with non-emitting sources, which I agree should include small modular nuclear reactors, for example, which are under development right now at this point in the United States.
Great. And we have a question from USA Today. So how serious do you think the Department of Defense generally takes climate change as a force multiplier in combat zones around the world, in terms of how it thinks about and approaches national security operations overseas?
Alex, you said, I mean, there's a lot of great national security leaders in this that can speak to this better than I, but I think the thing that speaks highly to the level of importance that the Defense Department puts on this issue is the recently appointed special advisor on climate to the Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense only has a handful of special advisors. The fact that there is a climate change advisor in his front office, a guy named Joe Bryan, working on these, I think speaks so much to the level of importance and the priority that the Defense Department is giving this issue.
Yeah, I'd say, it is one of the secretary's top 4 priorities along climate, COVID, China, and diversity and inclusion. And every service secretary also has a climate advisor. DoD is now conducting its own first climate risk assessment, and that which I'm advising them on, and that will enable DoD to really flow down climate risk assessments to the regional combatant commanders. That's where the work really needs to be done. And along with the scenarios, the wargaming and exercises that's called for, that's going to be very, very important. And I'd add that Deputy Secretary Hicks just recently outlined her climate priorities for DoD's FY23 budget. And it raises again the priority of climate change. She mentioned both installation resilience, green technologies in the supply chain, as well as addressing extreme heat to our troops. So I think it's an all hands on deck now from the top of the leadership flowing down throughout the department.
This is Ruben Geiger. Sorry.
Go ahead, Congressman.
Well, I think it's also important to remember the DoD doesn't actually make this call. This is the call of the civilian leadership, and that being the Armed Services Committee and the Congress. And Congress has consistently said through the NDAA every year that this is an issue that we need to invest in, and we continue to invest in. And we actually continue doing this even during the Trump administration, when they were not exactly a very green administration. So we've been actually pushing this, and so the DoD is implementing it. But just kind of, if you want to know about a strategy level, why does it matter? I'm sure you heard, stories of what Alex just said and John just said. I certainly saw it on the front lines. I was a Marine infantryman in Al-Anbar and found myself many times in some very far off cities. And unfortunately, there was a lot of young men and women that had to risk the roads to bring my unit diesel just to run the generators that we have, right? I know, for example, now that the military is also even investing in a lot of distributed solar for operations in far off areas, which will allow them to be more independent and more mobile. There's also now some water technology where we essentially will be able to create water by sucking the humidity out of the air. I know the DoD has already started investing in that. So there's a lot of innovations happening at the local level to make our forces more resilient. We're still investing in kind of green fuels right now to make sure that we have the ability to power our fleets, not just because we want to be green, but because we want to be energy independent. So there is a lot going on. I think that's extremely profitable for our armed services.
If I could, I was a major. I tried to stay away from the Pentagon as much as I could throughout my career. But I would like to maybe approach this question to the news folks a little differently. And this is with great respect to Admiral Gunn and his generation of warriors that were informed deeply by the Vietnam experience and the post-Vietnam experience. I think that politicians come and go. I think that bureaucracy lasts forever. But I think that the soldiers, airmen, Marines, and sailors that worked their way through the ranks and are going to be wearing the jewelry in the next 10 to 15 years have been very much influenced by the fact that over the last 20 years, we fought a war, at least partially because of oil. And we're looking at potential conflicts in the future as a result of increasing lack of resources, especially water and other minerals. I actually believe that the Pentagon, from the bottom up in this particular case, will be informed by the experiences of the leaders that continue to take the place of their seniors. Because we have been at war for so long, I think those lessons have been instilled. You can't do a tour in Afghanistan, Iraq, or in my case, Central and South America before I did Iraq and Afghanistan, and not recognize the challenges that are in front of you every day with a world that's changing. And I think that long term, the captains and the majors and lieutenants and the sergeants are going to be informing the Pentagon over the next 20 years and pushing it more and more toward a not just mitigating climate change, but actually trying to get ahead of it because it affects them and the kids are going to be sending in the future.
Well said. So we have a limited amount of time left and we have maybe more questions we can get to. So I'm going to go through a couple of questions and if someone wants to jump in and let's go round robin around these, if that works. So one question we have, will climate change alter the training or the missions of the armed forces in the future?
I'd like
Absolutely.
I'd like to jump on that and say absolutely, and it already is modifying it. Since 2008, the National Defense Guidance has included humanitarian assistance disaster response, for example, which I mentioned before. And the problem in the military is that prior to this being recognized as an official mission, then we didn't officially man, train, and equip to do it. And that and other kinds of missions that are associated with the consequences of climate change are now being incorporated into the regular training, into the wargaming, more importantly, perhaps, that the Defense Department is undertaking.
Anyone else want to jump in quickly on that one?
Yeah, just if you look at what some of the changes that we're doing right now, because the Arctic Circle is becoming, less Arctic, we're going to have to really start training a lot of our naval forces to actually operate in the Arctic Ocean, which is something that we're not even ready for. I'll give you a good example. Russia has 22 icebreakers. The United States Naval Force has 1. So this will severely alter how we train and how we procure.
Yes, and let me thank, I want to thank Congressman Geiger for your leadership on the Armed Services Committee over the many years to ensure that bipartisan direction to the Department of Defense on incorporating climate risks. It's been so vitally important, and I think it's helped enable the department to be in a leadership position now on a range of climate risk areas, from, as you say, learning how to reoperate in the Arctic, to addressing extreme heat for our troops, to making our military bases more climate resilient, climate proofed.
Okay, we have another question.
My pleasure.
Oh, someone else needs one?
No, just saying thank you. My pleasure.
Okay, absolutely. Where is the future of aviation fuels for national security applications? Who should lead? So, and if you want to take that more in a broader sense, the airline industry and aviation is about 2.5% of climate emissions, but also I would say shipping would be one of the largest countries' emissions if you were to take it too.
Well, I think it should be the Department of Energy that actually leads this up and not the military, because the applications go across everything. I mean, the Department of Energy also, it also handles our nuclear stocks. So this is actually an appropriate, I think they're an important department that has the experience both working in government and outside government. And I think that's, I don't think we want to reinvent the wheel when it comes to something like this.
Yes, well, I agree with that. And at the same time, the Department of Defense, because it is a big fuel user, can lead by example as the Department of Energy and others develop and direct that new standard for green aviation fuels. DoD can be one of the early buyers to help make the market for the broader adaptation of it.
Very true. And there's some very exciting electrified planes coming on the market. So I'm going to get to our last question here, and I'll summarize it a little bit. We haven't talked a lot about energy efficiency and water efficiency and that role in preserving our security. Then you'd like to comment on that, where they've seen success stories or where we can improve on.
Yeah, there's efforts across on the federal side, but also in the public side. But let me just step up to the federal side for a second. A lot of facilities are doing what are called energy savings performance contracts, where they look across their facilities and can bring significant investment from third parties to do things like increase their energy efficiency, replace lighting with LED lighting, address water efficiency, and finance it through their savings. So that's a wildly popular program amongst the federal government and growing. Just in the Obama administration, for instance, we did over $6 billion in those type of contracts. And there continue to be a lot of bipartisan support around that. But that's also happening in the public sector, because that many businesses are looking at the bottom line and saying, where can we find savings, and realizing that with certain investments in their HVAC systems or their building upgrades, they can not only have better buildings for their employees, but a better cost of energy and save money over the long run.
Excellent. Well, we'll leave it. We'll be building back better, as Mr. Powers is commonly themed here. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. If I didn't get to your question, please reach out. We will be able to set up individual meetings or responses afterward. Please, it's just alex@alexcornell.org or alex@protectingamerica.net. And we look forward to hearing from everyone and seeing everyone at the White House panel, which will be happening at 1300 or 1 o'clock. I do want to thank the American Security Project, Elected Officials to Protect America, the Truman National Security Project, the University of San Francisco Masters in Public Leadership, and the Veterans Energy Project for helping organize and put this event on. So thank you, everyone. If the speakers could just stand by.